Deputy Prime Minister. Kia ora everybody, and if that was really, really terrible, it's good to have a go. Today I'm joined by Education Minister Chris Hipkins to provide an update on the work we're doing to accelerate our recovery by getting more Kiwis into jobs and helping to keep them there. Before we turn to that announcement, looking to the week ahead, on Wednesday, the Prime Minister will deliver a speech virtually to a Business New Zealand audience about the upcoming budget and related matters. While she will not be able to be in Auckland, Minister Whāwhoi and Minister Hipkins will be there. On Thursday morning, as is traditional, I will be doing a pre-budget speech to the Wellington Chamber of Commerce. That morning, there will also be two special debates in Parliament, one on the carbon budgets and one on the report of the Select Committee on the Natural and Built Environments Act. There will be other announcements and speeches during the week, but a highlight for all of you, I'm sure, will be that I'm attending an announcement about the 2023 FIFA Women's World Cup in Auckland on Friday. Turning to today's announcement. Because we have one of the strongest economies in the world following the COVID-19 shock, with GDP up 5.6% from a year ago, unemployment at a record low and record exports, we have been able to invest significantly in building much-needed infrastructure. But when you invest in capital, you also have to invest in labour. We knew early on in our COVID-19 response that we would need to take action to ensure we didn't end up in the same situation that resulted after the global financial crisis. At that time, when the government turned off business support, employers let people go, particularly those who were still training. It was short-sighted and it created labour shortages that were subsequently filled by skyrocketing immigration numbers, and that had its own consequences for our infrastructure. We knew we had to be smarter this time, and with our borders closed, we chose to directly fund and support the training of our local workforce. At the start of the pandemic, as well as rolling out the wage subsidy, which helped businesses retain their current workforce, we created a program that funded employers to keep and take on new apprentices. The Apprenticeship Boost has to date supported more than 43,000 people to keep or get an apprenticeship. It funds employers per apprentice, providing a financial incentive for businesses to keep them on and put the time and effort needed into training them. It has been extremely successful. The number of apprentices has increased by 55% in 2 years. The plan is working. The Apprenticeship Boost is one of the many reasons unemployment has fallen to 3.2%, a record low. And in the past quarter, we've had more people come off the benefit and move into work than at any time since the Ministry of Social Development began keeping electronic records in 1996. And that brings me to why Minister Hipkins is with us today, because through Budget 2022, we are continuing to invest in our people in order to provide job security and a skilled workforce ready to participate in our recovery. Today we are announcing an extension to the Apprenticeship Boost program out to the end of next year. That means we'll be supporting around 38,000 apprentices, 24,000 of which are likely to be new apprentices, and 14,000 who will continue to benefit from the program beyond August this year. We're also adding 1,600 places to Mana and Mahi, an incredibly successful program that already supports over 4,700 young Kiwis to move off a benefit and gain the skills and qualifications they need to fill gaps in the workforce. Part of the budget, we're also extending funding for Maori trades training. This is a bespoke program run through the Ministry of Social Development in partnership with 17 Maori entities across Aotearoa that does work-focused training for rangatahi. These are programs that are making a difference to people's lives and are ensuring that we aren't making the same mistakes of the past, such as only relying on immigration to fill our skill gaps. In these tough times, ensuring New Zealanders have the support they need to get trained and find work while providing business with the skilled workers they need is a key thing that the government can do to help drive our recovery. I'll now pass over to Minister Hipkins to provide you with a bit more information.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. It is very good today to be able to confirm that we'll be extending the Apprenticeship Boost program out to the end of next year, benefiting around 38,000 apprentices. We expect that to include around 24,000 new apprentices and around 14,000 apprentices who will continue to be supported by the scheme. It also means that new employers will be able to sign up. There are currently around 17,000 employers registered and receiving that additional support. We've had a lot of positive feedback from businesses over the last 2 years as a result of this program. We know that it's allowed them to keep people on, and the people who they've invested their time and effort into, even when they've been at the toughest points of the global pandemic. Today's investment through Budget 2022 of a further $230 million means the program will extend to the end of next year, ensuring that we can get on with the job of building houses and upgrading infrastructure whilst training up the future workforce at the same time. Apprenticeship numbers have considerably increased since the start of the pandemic. As at the end of February this year, there were 56,000 apprentices funded by the Tertiary Education Commission, compared to 37,000 at the same time in 2020, an increase of 55% over 2 years. We're also succeeding in getting more women into the trades. Since the Apprenticeship Boost was introduced, there has been an 88% increase in the number of women doing apprenticeships. They are up to nearly 8,000 today. The program has also supported 7,325 Maori apprentices, which is around 17% of all of those receiving the Apprenticeship Boost, and 3,075 Pacific apprentices, which is around 7%. There's still plenty more that we need to do around diversity in the trades, but we've been making some pretty solid progress. In recognition of the significant growth in apprentices since 2020 and the very strong labour market that we have at the moment, we are making a change to the funding rates attached to the Apprenticeship Boost. In order to extend the initiative at a reasonable cost, the first year subsidy rate will be lowered to $500 per month per apprentice, and that will start from the 5th of August 2022, and the second year rate will remain the same at $500 per month per apprentice. So I want to congratulate the record numbers of people starting in their apprenticeships and thank employers for taking on apprentices and making sure that they are learning whilst they are also earning. It's a testament to all of them that the program has been so successful.
Thanks, Minister Hipkins. I think what we'll do is take questions for Minister Hipkins and around the announcement first, and then he'll depart and I'll carry on. So, Mikey.
Minister, can you just explain how much that per month per apprentice funding will drop by?
So it was $1,000. We're basically standardising the first and second year rate. So it was previously $1,000 in the first year and $500 in the second year. We're now standardising that to $500 a month.
And why do we need more apprentices?
There's no question that skill shortages have been something that New Zealand suffered from a long time, and building and construction has been right up there in terms of areas of skill shortage. That's been one of the biggest areas of increase in apprenticeship numbers. But actually you'll find in all of those areas where we have apprenticeships that are being subsidised, there have been areas of skill shortage. So it's a very well targeted investment in terms of being able to address those long-term skill shortages the country's been suffering from.
So, Minister, why have you decided to halve the subsidy in the first year, given the success of the last 2 years? Surely we need more apprentices.
Well, ultimately we made the decision to extend the subsidy. So there wouldn't have been a subsidy at all if we'd decided not to extend it. And we do have to recognise we've got a very strong labour market at the moment. We've seen very strong growth in apprenticeship numbers. I think we're confident that we'll continue to sustain a very strong level of apprenticeship numbers and also growth as well with the new rates that we've announced today.
So how much have you saved by halving the first year?
Well, the overall numbers, I can give you, as I indicated to you, I think the first year apprentice numbers are around 24,000 and about 14,000 in their second year. So you can kind of work out that it does lower the cost to a level where we can sustain it for longer.
So why not keep it going forever, given the success of it?
Look, at the moment we're announcing it through to the end of next year. You never say never.
On school absenteeism, there's been high absenteeism and school are worried that they may lose a lot of their funding because of that. Whangarei Intermediate Principal is calling on you to keep the status quo for that per student funding into next year. Is that something you would consider? Schools won't lose funding for absenteeism. They don't lose funding now. They never have. Schools are funded based on the number of students who are on their roll rather than whether or not those students show up, and we're not proposing to change that. Where there are roll fluctuations from year to year, yes, school funding does change. Where there's a significant change in a school's circumstances, then I'd encourage them to work with the Ministry of Education to make sure that they're getting all of the support that they can to smooth that out. When students do fall off rolls, then that would affect their funding. Is there any sort of wiggle room or sort of assurances that you can give schools that they won't suddenly be working with a reduced budget because students have fallen off their radar?
I'm confident that increased absence is not, resulting in decreased school funding, but I am concerned about increased absence. And so that's why you saw the announcement that we made last weekend about getting kids back into school. And our message to parents is now is the time to get kids back into school as well. I am concerned, that our attendance numbers are not where they need to be.
And just switching, to COVID, while we have you, Michael Baker has suggested that fourth dose of vaccine for people most at risk, has suggested a fourth dose for those most at risk. Are you considering this, and how far off would it be?
Yes, we are, and as I indicated last week, I think when asked that, we've been getting advice on that, and we've got some logistical issues to work through around the authorisation process for fourth doses, and we're working our way through that. But I think it is likely that we will, have more to say about that in the next week or two.
And are you concerned about the two new variants, or the new variant rather?
All new variants are, something that we monitor very closely. At the moment, the greatest variant activity is still within the Omicron family, and so we haven't seen anything yet to suggest that our current public health measures aren't sufficient to deal with any new variants that we're seeing so far. But of course, it's a rapidly changing situation, and we monitor international developments on variants very, very closely.
And there's some information emerging from South Africa where the BA5 obviously originated, that actually it isn't particularly more transmissible, and it's not didn't lead to any greater excess mortality than earlier versions of the Omicron variant. But as the Minister says, we monitor it closely.
How quickly can we pivot if we need to, in terms of our response and our plan?
Well, our whole response all the way along has pivoted quickly when we've needed to. But we still have public health measures in place at the moment. And one of the reasons that we have public health measures in place at the moment is because there is still a global pandemic raging around the world. And things like mask use and the various other measures that we have in place are making a difference.
Minister, what's the government going to do about the escalating number of RAN raids that have been occurring?
I'm just going to check before we come to that, Jason, whether there are any other questions for Minister Hipkins, and then we'll pick that up. Mikey?
Well, last question on that topic, but it's for you. Does that count?
Yeah, we can go there, yeah.
So halving the subsidy, is this a sign, Minister Robertson, that you are tightening the belt? Is this a sign of more to come?
It's a sign of making sure that we're targeting our spending to where we can have the biggest impact. And to take Minister Hipkins' point, we're extending the subsidy. Within that, we're making use of $230 million to make sure that we have apprentices looked after. The feedback that we've had from the employers is that they will welcome this. They'll continue to use it. It's been a very important part of making sure people have not only completed their apprentices, but that employers have the workforce that they need. So it is about providing targeted support to extend a successful program.
So you haven't had any indications from smaller employers that would hurt them in the sense that they would just say, we're not going to go there?
No, we've had really good support from employers, and in fact the feedback that we had when, through informal conversations with employers is that, they just want to see the scheme continue.
So just on the 190,000 who went through the scheme, do you have any idea of how many have actually stayed on as tradespeople, and what the dropout rates were and that sort of thing?
Well, so that number that you're mentioning covers both the Apprenticeship Boost and also the extra support we've provided for trades training off the job as well. So the fees-free component of that too. We've had really high retention rates. I had the number this morning. I'll get it to you anyway. But the retention rates have been incredibly high, bearing in mind that these are the first and the second year apprentices. And so we haven't seen a drop-off rate at the end of the second year, for example, once the subsidy no longer applies. Generally, the feedback from employers is it's those first 2 years that are the most critical, because it's the time when those new apprentices require the most support. As they get through their apprenticeship more, there's more things they can do on their own. They're much more productive, and therefore, potentially less of a drain on the business. And so that's why we targeted those first 2 years.
Right, thanks.
I've got one up as well, sorry. Public sector wages are only up 2.7% this last year, lagging private sector wages. When the next public sector pay claims come through, can public sector workers expect to have their wages lifted in line with the cost pressures that they've seen.
Well, I'm not
last year.
going to bargain with the public sector workforce here, but what I would say is that yes, there was a shift in that last year, and that's off the back of about 3 years where public sector wage growth was running ahead of the private sector wage growth. So if you look at it over a 15-year or so horizon, the rates of growth in the public and private sector are comparable.
Are you concerned about stoking the when you lift public sector wages, that public sector being quite a large workforce, are you worried about stoking the wage component of overall inflation and setting up a wage price?
Look, people do need to think about this more than just in a one-year cycle. As the Minister of Finance, I'm sure, will give you a chapter and verse. We have to actually think beyond that when we're thinking about things like wages and bargaining, and the government absolutely will be. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't mean there's not going to be a lot of pressure on the other side. We fully expect there will be.
Minister, just back on that round question.
So we'll let Ms Hipkins go. Thank you there. Yeah, Jason, look, as the Prime Minister indicated, I think this morning, and Minister Williams yesterday, we are working on a package to support particularly small businesses around the issues that have arisen recently with ram raids. It'll be similar, the approach we're looking at doing would be similar to what we did with fog cannons, where the government can carry a part of the cost, potentially quite a large part of the cost of installation of those. We're finalising the details of that. There are a number of matters to get right around this. There are actually local authority rules around the placement of things like bollards, and we have to work those through as well, whether there are alternatives to bollards where you can't use bollards because of that or some other reason. But that is our intention, to provide that kind of support similar to what we did with fog cannons.
Give us a time frame first, and then a ballpark figure of what exactly or how much we can be expecting, and if that's coming from budget allocation.
So in terms of the first part of the question, I would expect to have something to say about that within the next week or two. Meetings and discussions have been going on, and obviously that was why ministers talked about it yesterday and why the Prime Minister talked about it this morning. In terms of the cost, you'll need to wait till then, but there are a number of sources of potential funding.
Will you be keeping half-price public transport fares in the budget next week?
Well, I'm not going to announce the budget today, but what we did say at the time that we released, put out that policy, was that it was a temporary policy to support people through this period with the inflation spike. We continue to review that and review the impact of people, but it was never designed as a permanent policy. It was done in line with the inflation increase.
You also
But
said
people
at the
love
time
it.
you
Public
announced that it
transport's
would
up.
tide you over to the end of the current fiscal year and the beginning of the next fiscal year, at which point the budget, which takes into account the recommendations of the emissions reduction plan, which recommends reducing public transport fares, will take effect.
Yeah, and as I say, I'll announce the budget next week, but I just want to be clear that that decision was one that was taken on a temporary basis. We said we would look at the ongoing global situation, and we do continue to review it.
Just really quickly,
When
are you happy
Henry.
with the
when was your last cabinet meeting to finalise budget decisions? And was it any later than usual?
It was about the same time as usual.
And when was that?
That's usually in April.
Are you happy with?
Do you feel like you've had time to address cost of living, which is really inflation, which has really come up as an issue in the last 6 months, given the budget process usually starts around November, when things work quite
Look,
bad?
we've become incredibly flexible with the way that we put budgets together through the course of the last 2 years. You'll recall that the budget we did in 2020, we effectively rewrote over a few days, not long before we delivered it. So we do have the ability to be able to be flexible from the process, which actually starts in about August of the previous year and works its way all the way through until we finalise it at the package in April. And then we do a lot of work to produce what you get next week. So we've had some time to think about what we're doing, and I think the package that we're going to put out is a careful balance to make sure that we do give stability and security to New Zealanders, but all those details are out next week.
Are you prepared to travel to the US in the case that the Prime Minister is unable to because of the COVID infection?
I'll just say that again.
Are you prepared to travel to the US in the case that the Prime Minister is
Oh,
unable
look, that's
to?
not something we've considered at all, and the Prime Minister fully expects to be able to travel to the US.
Isn't that something you should consider though?
The Supreme Court is considering overturning Roe v. Wade. Can I just get your reaction to that? And also, are you satisfied with where abortion laws are in New Zealand at the moment?
Well, on the latter point, obviously, we made changes to abortion laws last term, and I think that was a terrific advance to be able to move that to be more of a health issue and less of an issue within the justice system or the justice acts. And so, yes, I'm satisfied with where we are. Obviously, we have advisory groups that continue to give us advice on what we may or may not need to do. On the first point, it's always, we try to avoid commenting on other countries and other countries' political situations. In this case, all I can state is that as a personal view, I strongly back a woman's right to choose. And I think that around the world you're seeing a reaction to this, and particularly in the United States, and particularly from women, that I can completely understand. And obviously in New Zealand, I'm pleased with where we are. For women in America today, I can see why they'd be very, very concerned.
Are you pleased to hear National giving its support to the climate emissions budget that Minister Shaw released this morning?
I am. I'll be even more pleased when it comes time for the release of the emissions reduction plans next week to see whether or not National back those. Because unfortunately they have a history from when they were in government of making claims about the kinds of reductions they'd like to see in emissions, but then not backing it with action. Now is the time for them to back the emissions reduction plans, back the actual actions that will start to see us move the dial on climate. So obviously we'll give them time to have a look at those plans, but if it's just another hollow acceptance of a target without an action, then that's not good enough.
So you're putting it back on them to not play politics over climate?
Well, our view is that the Climate Commission's work was independent. They set the budgets. We have by and large endorsed those budgets. We now as a country have to take action to get ourselves to the goals of the Zero Carbon Act and the goals of the carbon budgets. That will come through our emissions reduction plans. The challenge I'm putting down to the National Party is back your words with actions, unlike what you did when you were in government.
Nicola Willis gave a speech today as finance spokesperson and criticised the government's wasteful spending. Are you confident you're getting value for every dollar you spend?
I'm confident that we work very hard to make sure we get value for money for New Zealanders. I'm also confident that we have had external validation of the way that we've been running the economy. We've had 2 ratings agencies give us AAA credit ratings. We've had the IMF and the OECD congratulate New Zealand on not only our health performance through COVID, but also our economic performance through COVID. We will continually, as we do every year, push to make sure we are getting the best value for taxpayers, but I'm not going to accept criticisms of the government's economic performance that aren't founded on fact.
What do you make of ACT's alternative budgets, including cutting around 14,000 public service workers?
Well, I think it's equal parts naive and dangerous. I don't think it's what New Zealanders need. But in the end, David Seymour can produce a budget like that because there's no chance of him ever being able to actually implement it. The more important question here is, what does Christopher Luxon take from what David Seymour has said? Because if the National Party were to end up in government, it would be with ACT. And so Christopher Luxon has to answer the question of whether he's going to lift the age of the pension, whether he's going to cut the winter energy payment, whether he's going to freeze the minimum wage, whether he's going to abolish a range of government programs and agencies that support some of the most vulnerable in our communities. So that's really where my interest in Mr Seymour's announcement lies.
Do you need to show restrained spending next week?
I think we've got to get a careful balance, and part of that is making sure that we spend in a targeted way, that we make sure that we are addressing the issues that New Zealanders need us to address. And we've got a track record of that. We have actually kept debt lower than almost all of the countries that we would compare ourselves to. We've done that while also keeping unemployment down and by making sure that we have had good, solid economic growth. So it's about a balance, it's about targeting our spending, and it's about looking both to the near term, which is very important, but also to the longer term. I think one of the mistakes that has been made in New Zealand over many years is that we tend to focus just on the short term and don't invest enough in long-term programs. And I've already signalled that the 2 areas for this budget that we're focused on are the revamping of the health system and climate change. Both of those are about making sure we've got security for New Zealanders over coming decades.
The Reserve Bank said last week that they thought the house prices were anywhere between 5 to 20% above their sustainable levels. Do you agree with that assessment, and would a 20% fall be a problem for the government?
As you know, because you've asked me the question many times before, I tend not to put percentages on it. The job we've given the Reserve Bank is to think about house prices as they're setting their financial and monetary policies, and so they've given you that range. In terms of what happens with house prices, whether they fall or not, Again, I haven't commented on when they've gone up in terms of what I would like and what I would do in terms of whether they decrease. What we've wanted is a housing market where more people can buy their first home and where it is a much fairer and more sustainable market. We'll see where we get to over the next couple of years. Our job is to set the policy settings. What I would note that some of the drops that are being forecast by certainly bank economists at the moment would only take us back to 2020 or 2019 levels.
And
Minister,
the
why-
Reserve Bank also said it would be in a position to start imposing debt-to-income multiple restrictions next year, possibly before the election. What's your view at the moment on whether that's needed, or how it might affect first home buyers? Because as I understand it, the first quarter there's been a big drop in the share of homes bought by first home buyers.
Yeah, look, obviously when we agreed that the debt-to-income ratios could be in the toolkit of the Reserve Bank, we said that that had to be done with as little impact as possible on first home buyers. So the design of the debt-to-income ratios, how and when they are implemented, needs to take that into account. I'll come to
Minister,
Janae.
why don't you want to put numbers around house prices or housing affordability? Because we have targets around all sorts of things, and it isn't actually the Reserve Bank's job specifically to target prices or affordability. So why won't you comment on that?
Because there are many things that drive house prices. Not all of them are in the government's control. What we've committed to is making sure that we will have a policy framework that we believe will lead to more affordable houses, that will mean more first home buyers can buy. And so we focus on making sure that we get the settings right. Speculating on individual percentages at any given moment when there are so many forces and factors that apply to that, I don't think is that helpful. What I have said is that I want them to be more sustainable than they are, and we've taken policy action to go towards that.
Part of the government targets CPI, and none of that's in the government's control.
Well, CPI is targeted by the Reserve Bank on our behalf, yes, and that is their job, and they do that, and you're able to see the tool that they use to make that happen.
I'm just
Sorry,
on
this
issue of numbers, though. I mean, there are a number of areas where there are a number of factors that influence an outcome. So house prices are no different to that. Would it not make sense to provide a range of what is affordable, what is sustainable, and so we can tweak all the different things to reach that goal?
Well, as Ben has already pointed out, the Reserve Bank have given a range that they believe where sustainable house prices, or where house prices need to get to be sustainable. You can draw on that. From the point of view of the government, our focus is making sure that we have the settings, the policy settings in place that make it a more affordable market, that make it easier for first home buyers, and that's where our focus remains.
Just on climate and the National Party, you were talking about the independence of the Climate Change Commission. Is it your view that if National doesn't back the ERP, their climate policy or climate views aren't evidence-based, essentially?
Look, I think it's the track record of the National Party here that worries me. So it was all very well to go to Paris and say this is what we think New Zealand's commitment should be, but then to not take action on that, I think means that their commitment was hollow. Now they have an opportunity where it's not about us per se. We've had the Climate Change Commission's report. We've got a set of emissions reductions plans which are to meet those those carbon budgets. This is now their opportunity to back those actions. Or if they've got other actions that can achieve the same thing, by all means put those in front of the public. But I do think it needs to be based on facts and evidence, and I do think there is an opportunity here for the National Party to climb into the 21st century and get on board with climate change issues. We'll come down to John and then Amelia.
Minister, what if any aid or military support will the government provide to Ukraine this week?
Don't think there are any announcements planned for this week. Obviously, we made significant announcements around the support that we're giving to Ukraine, both in terms of the people on the ground that we have supporting the logistics, the intelligence, and the money that we've provided via the United Kingdom, plus the humanitarian support. Cabinet continues to keep that under watch, but I'm not aware of any announcements this week.
The United Kingdom has pledged another £1.8 billion, and the United States Congress is considering a $33 billion US dollar package of assistance.
Absolutely, and it's on the minds of all governments, and as I said, we continue to consider what further support we can provide.
Yeah, just back on the emissions budget. So Cabinet's adopted broadly sort of what the climate change you will adopt pretty much the draft plan?
Oh, look, a lot of work has gone into the emissions reduction plans, and what the Climate Commission put forward to us was essentially a challenge for us to go away and look at transport or energy or industrial heat or building and construction and say, what will you do? What are the specific things that you will do? And so we've taken our time to build on what we've been given, and in the end, those plans have to be able to reach those carbon budgets. And so I think you'll see on Monday the comprehensive nature of what we've put together.
And just on how would you rate New Zealand's climate action to date? Are you proud of what New Zealand has done in the climate action space so far?
I'm pleased that New Zealand has taken on board the Climate Commission, made sure that we've set that up, the Zero Carbon Act. We've definitely got more to do. So I'm pleased that we've been able to start making progress in terms of these building blocks, but we can never be satisfied with where we are today. We do need to do more. We need to make sure that not only are we meeting the goals that we've set ourselves within the Zero Carbon Act, but we're doing that in such a way that New Zealanders are able to look forward for their children and their grandchildren to a planet that is still here, that is still able to be lived on properly, and to make sure that we can find within that opportunities for New Zealand. And I think what you'll hear about on Monday when we do the emissions reduction plans is not just the environmental challenge that we're all aware of, but also the opportunities that exist for New Zealand to be able to create higher wage jobs, to be able to innovate within a low emissions economy. So I think, there's much more to do. I'm pleased we've made the start we've made, but no one pretends the job's anywhere near done.
The government is halfway through the Fed and cut period. Are you going...
I'm sorry, I did miss the beginning of that.
The government is halfway through its period of cutting Fed and RUC, and petrol prices have returned close to where they were when you made that announcement. Are you going to extend it when the 3-month term comes up?
I think what you've said highlights the volatility of the situation, because obviously the prices went down slightly and then have gone back up again. What we've said is we'll continue to keep that under review.
When will the review be when we discuss what
when we announce it?
On inflation, is it your view that the government needs to do what it can to reduce aggregate demand into the economy? Or is that not your...
Oh, look, I think it is challenging at the moment where we obviously have had demand that is not met by supply. I think it's been important that the government has supported New Zealanders through COVID. We've kept people in work. We've made sure that there are good jobs and there is support for industries to keep going. If you just take an example like construction, where there's massive demand and that is pushing up against supply chain constraints. Normally, in normal times, that would be fine, and we would have as much gibboard as we need, many building products come in as we need. The problem with that would be if the government were to step back from our public housing build, we would be doing a disservice to current generations and future generations of New Zealanders. So we have to strike a balance here. We have to make sure that we're targeting our support, investing in the areas that are needed. But that level of demand is certainly a factor, but normally it would be met by supply. And unfortunately, certainly in the short term, we can't do that.
Just one follow on that. We seem to be around maximum sustainable employment. You'd probably widely agree with that. Why are you still pumping money into policies like Jobs for Nature and other job creation checks that would make sense in a high unemployment situation, but that's not the situation we're in? And have you considered cutting them?
We're not pumping further money into those. Those are programs that have already been set up and are being worked through and are coming to fruition. I say again what I've said here before. I stood on this podium and had a Treasury report that told me we were going to have 10% unemployment. We've worked hard alongside New Zealanders to make sure that unemployment is at 3.2%. We can still continue, as Minister Hipkins was announcing today, to support people to get more skills and to make sure that we have the best result for New Zealanders here. But we also have to start thinking about inward immigration, expanding the labour supply as well. Joe. Sorry, Joe.
Could you reduce that spending going forwards? I mean, most of these policies
we continually look at all of the policies and whether or not the investments are needed. But if you're looking at Jobs for Nature, those are programs that have been well underway, and I'm not going to cut them in the middle of them. Joe.
Just going back to the health reforms, Chris Luxon's been quite clear about the fact that he doesn't see a need for the Māori Health Authority separate from, say, a directorate within the Ministry of Health system. there's going to be a lot of expectations, I guess, around how much money you're going to put into that in the budget, but also that leads to how much sort of achievement or results you're going to see early on as well, because it will take time, as we know, with a new system like that. Do you feel a little bit, I guess, under pressure with an election 18 months away? Are you going to be able to deliver results with the Māori Health Authority in time to convince people that it was worth it?
Before I come to that, I admire your faith in what the National Party's position is on the Māori Health Authority, because I've heard a number of different positions, including that they'll keep it if it's working, that they'll get rid of it, or that, as you say, they'll use some existing mechanism inside the Ministry of Health. So I'm not at all clear on what the National Party's position is. In terms of the second part of your question, it will take time, and I think everybody in the health system understands the magnitude of the change. We're determined that people will be able to see a difference in the services that they receive, and we're going to make sure that there is support available for, particularly for Māori providers who are going to be working with the Māori Health Authority, to be able to start delivering programs. We are needing to design this as we go and deliver as we go. And one of the reasons we've structured the health budget the way we have, by doing a 2-year budget this time, and then once we have the New Zealand Health Plan, 3-year budgets from then on, is to enable us to do as much work as we can now, see as much change as we can now. But I don't want to underestimate the significance of the reforms here, and particularly the creation of a Māori Health Authority to deal with, generational inequity in our health system. So yes, we will be asking people to be a little patient, but there should also be some good changes and good service provision changes that people will see.
There's certainly been indications, even from Andrew Little, that it could be 4 or 5 years before you start to see fundamental change. We all know the slow wheels of bureaucracy, and while it's optimistic and ambitious to do something big, you must know the restraints and, I guess, the potential breaks that can go on with these sorts of things. I mean, how much change are you really expecting to see in the next year?
Look, as I say, it will be somewhat of a slow burn, and everybody in the health system understands that. But the government has within its wherewithal to both make the change but also continue to invest in programs and use some of the shifts to be able to demonstrate the benefits people will see. And you even saw that in the announcement that Minister Little made last week about planned care. We're actually using the Health New Zealand approach to be able to break that logjam. So I think we can make progress while we are fully developing the system. But again, just to repeat what I just said, I think people understand when it's the health system and it's this big, it will take time to see the full impact of all of those changes.
Minister, in Australia, the two major candidates have clashed over foreign policy. If there is a change of government there this month, which looks very likely, how do you think that will affect Australia's foreign policy, particularly towards China and the Solomons and similar issues that concern New Zealand?
As I said before, we tend not to comment too much on other people's elections or policies. What I would say is New Zealand, no matter who's in government in Australia, will continue to work closely with Australia in our region. We have done that for many years and we will continue to do that. When it comes to the relationship that Australia has with other countries, that's the bit I'm not going to comment on from New Zealand's perspective. We'll continue to work with them and continue to advance the interests of the Pacific region. I'll take Janae and Benedict and we'll finish.
Just further to Henry's questions around inflation, how nimble do you think fiscal policy needs to be in response to a macroeconomic environment? For example, with COVID, we saw it be very nimble. Do you see a return to sort of more normal times where it's not as nimble, or do you think COVID has sort of shifted things a bit?
I think it's really important that we provide as much certainty and stability as we can. And that's certainly what you've seen from us in the past and you will continue to see from us. But we do respond when we need to. We did that most recently with the fuel excise duty cuts and the halving of the public transport costs. So fiscal policy can be nimble and move, and when the time is right, that's exactly what we'll do. But as I signalled in the speech last week, I do think the stage we're now at with COVID particularly means that we can start, for example, bringing things like the fiscal rules back so that we've got a bit more certainty and clarity. As you're well aware, I'm keen on multi-year funding because that is another way that we can do that. So Yep, there'll always be examples of the importance of nimbleness, but I also think New Zealanders need a government that is providing them that stability and security. Finishing with Bernard.
Have you been getting any reports or advice on the impact the half-price public transport has had on demand?
I've seen media reports on that, and I think Minister Wood would be the person to go to see what other, any more detailed reports than what you've seen. But certainly, anecdotally, we have seen a significant increase in demand. And obviously, one of the things we are trying to do as part of the Climate Emergency Response Fund is make sure that we can support New Zealanders to be able to make mode shifts. Again, some of that takes time. We've got to make sure that we get the infrastructure right, make sure that we get all of the building blocks of this.
You might want to expand out for more than 3 months, yeah?
As I say, those announcements are for another day.
Have you enjoyed the half-price public transport yourself?
I have not, no. Unfortunately, nowadays, public transport's not something I'm able to take, largely for security reasons.
Just for clarity's sake, so will there be clarity for New Zealanders who have been enjoying the half-price public transport fares on Monday or Thursday next week?
Good try, Amelia. Making sure I put my mask on appropriately. Turning to today's announcement. Because we have one of the strongest economies in the world following the COVID-19 shock, with GDP up 5.6% from a year ago, unemployment a record low and record exports, we have been able to invest significantly in building much needed infrastructure. But when you invest in capital, you also have to invest in labour. We knew early on in our COVID-19 response that we would need to take action to ensure